DDR5 memory's coming! Oh wait, it's already being used in high-end smartphones, but it isn't available to the average person. So in this video, I'm going to explain the differences between the current gen DDR4 memory and DDR5, and whether you should go for DDR5 for your next build, or whether you should upgrade to it when it comes out. I'm going to go relatively in-depth about the differences so you can hopefully be better informed about this new standard. I'll also leave timestamps below for your convenience. Oh, before we jump in, DDR5 is not backward compatible with DDR4 because a DDR4 DIMM slot is physically different from a DDR4 slot. Anyway, the first thing I'm sure you're wondering about is capacity. Well, a DDR5 stick of DRAM can be up to 4 times more storage dense than a stick of DDR4 RAM. So you probably know that a stick of RAM has multiple ICs, let's just call them chips, but you might not know that there can be up to 16 of these, 8 on each side. Each of these chips on DDR4 can only have a capacity of up to 2 gigabytes. So when you multiply that out, you find that you can have up to 32 gigabytes of RAM on a single DDR4 stick. Of course, there are some exceptions in the server market with load-reduced DIMM modules, but we're not even going to get into those weeds in this video. But with DDR5, each of those chips can have a capacity of up to 8 gigabytes. Multiply that by 16 and you find that you can have up to a 128 gigabyte RAM stick. Although remember that it's not like you're going to have 128 gig modules as soon as DDR5 hits the mainstream, since the supply chain and manufacturing have to gradually refine their processes. Alright, so that's capacity, but what about bandwidth and clock speed? Well, DDR4 has an official speed cap at 3200 MHz, although you'll find 3600, 4000, and even 5100 MHz DIMMs, and that's just down to really good quality silicon being able to be binned and overclocked really far. DDR5 has a max speed of, wait for it, 6400 MHz, though once again we're most likely going to see even higher speeds eventually, 8400 MHz according to SK Hynix's data. DDR5 also has a big jump in terms of memory bandwidth. I mean, obviously it does, since memory speed directly impacts memory bandwidth. Anyway, DDR4 has a maximum bandwidth of 3.2 gigabits per second per pin. Once again, it can be wider if you have higher than 3200 MHz DIMMs, but let's just stick with 3.2 gigabits per second. DDR5, on the other hand, is going to have a maximum bandwidth of 6.4 gigabits per second, although, again, the manufacturing process is going to have to work its way up there. Okay, so now we're going to start to work our way deeper into this rabbit hole and talk about the RAM channels. Now, you may be familiar with dual channel, quad channel, and yeah, even triple channel RAM back when that was a thing. Anyway, adding more channels of RAM allows that many more tunnels of communication between your memory controller, which got moved from the North Bridge to the CPU, and your DRAM. So just know that having two 8 gig DIMMs running in dual channel is faster than running one 16 gig stick in single channel, at least for CPU heavy tasks. And your CPU and motherboard have to support the number of channels you're going for. You can't just run quad channel memory on a Ryzen 5 2600. I mean, you can still have 4 DIMMs, but you'll still be in dual channel. Anyway, one DDR4 module has one channel made up of 64 bits that are for data and 8 bits for error correction code, if you do have ECC RAM. But get this, one DDR5 DIMM runs in dual channel. That's pretty cool. Each rank, or channel, in DDR5 is going to have 32 data bits and 8 ECC bits. So if you multiply that by 2 for 2 channels, you get a total of the same 64 data bits as DDR4 and 16 ECC bits. And the cherry on top is that ECC is a required spec for DDR5. So a bit error that would have caused you to skip a frame or crash completely on mortal DDR4 RAM will be flipped and fixed on DDR5. Alright, so this next one is a little bit more involved, but it is something that affects performance, and that is the burst length. So DDR4 RAM has a burst length of 8, and DDR5 has a burst length of 16. Okay, the last thing about DDR5 is, I'm just kidding, of course I'll explain what burst length is. But before that, we need to understand how data is read off a RAM module. The bits the data are stored on those RAM chips I mentioned earlier in grids with rows and columns. For the record, DDR4 RAM chips typically have about 130,000 rows and 1,024 columns. So in a grossly oversimplified example, let's say a CPU requests the bit from a DDR4 RAM module at row 1, column 1. Your module then has to open that row up. The time it takes to do so is the second number in RAM's timings, the TRCD, and is measured in clock cycles for synchronous DRAM and in nanoseconds for asynchronous DRAM. However, let's say that now your CPU is asking for access to row 1, column 2. Well, instead of closing the row, the time it takes to do this is the TRP, it will keep that row open and access row 1, column 2. It can do this 6 more times for a grand total of 8. The number of bits it can allow access to before closing the corresponding row is the burst length. As I said, DDR4 has a burst length of 8, while DDR5 has a burst length of 16. So while this is a more hidden spec, a system equipped with DDR5 memory will experience fewer delays that are caused by closing and reopening a row. Okay, now for real, the last important feature of DDR5 is the voltage/power regulation. Currently, DDR4's VDD is 1.2 volts, obviously 1.35 volts and higher for XMP, DOCP, and overclocking, but we want to try to stay as stock as possible. DDR5, on the other hand, will have an operating VDD of 1.1 volts. What's more is that each DIMM will manage its own voltage and power via a power management IC that's on the module itself instead of being managed by the motherboard like for DDR4 memory. So this means greater efficiency, lower power states, better dynamic power adjustments, current monitoring, threshold protection, and potentially even a lower bill of materials cost. Alright, with all that tech explained or tech-splained, we can talk about when it'll hit the mainstream for desktops and laptops, and whether you should go for it. As I said at the beginning of the video, LPDDR5 RAM is already being used in high-end smartphones, but desktop users will have to wait a little longer. Intel's 12th gen Alder Lake CPUs are rumored to have support for DDR5, which presumably means that some of the accompanying chipset motherboards will have support for DDR5 because, as I said, DDR4 is not backward compatible with DDR4. Anyway, Alder Lake is rumored to release in late 2021, although it could be early 2022 as well. AMD's Zen 4 CPUs are also rumored to launch in 2022 with support for DDR5. So that's all well and good, but if you're thinking about building or upgrading a PC when DDR5 is supported and everything, should you go for DDR5? It seems like a no-brainer, right? Just go for DDR5, but the thing is that at the beginning, DDR5 won't be as good as it'll get because just like DDR4, it'll gradually get better and more refined. On top of that, you'll also have to pay the early adopter tax since it'll presumably be more expensive when it first hits the mainstream. So my suggestion is if you're going to upgrade a PC sometime, you really don't care when, waiting for DDR5 to get cheaper would be the route to go. If you're building a PC and you need one now, obviously you're going to go with DDR4 since that's what's available right now. However, this is the last scenario. If you're building a computer, you don't need it now, and you're someone who spends a lot of money on a computer and keeps it for a long time, then I would wait for DDR5 to come out. Additionally, if you don't mind paying a little more while getting a little less performance, you can get DDR5 as soon as it's available, or you can wait for it to get cheaper and better. So hopefully that gave you guys way too much information that anyone should know about DRAM, and if it did, then why not hit that like button to let the algorithm know you enjoyed it, and consider subscribing for more tech content on the way. But other than that, I will see you in the next video.